that explores the deeper meaning of those unexpected moments when God wakes us up at 3 a.m., encouraging introspection, trust, and spiritual growth. Would you like me to now develop the full speech based on these ideas? At 3 a.m., when the world is asleep, it's as though a special kind of attention is focused on us. It is not merely the ticking of the clock or the turning of the night into the day that awakens us, but something far deeper, something deliberate. In the midst of our slumber, God, in His infinite grace, calls us to Himself. It's a divine invitation, not one of inconvenience or disturbance, but of care and concern. He knows that in the quiet of the early morning, when the noise of the day has not yet begun, we are more attuned to our inner selves, more aware of our thoughts, and more open to hearing His voice. This waking is not random or accidental. God doesn't need us to be awake at any specific hour to hear us, for He is always listening. Yet, by waking us in the silence of the night, He teaches us to slow down, to pay attention to Him in a way that we often neglect during the rush of our daily lives. In these moments, God seeks our attention not just for His benefit, but for ours. It's a time when we are no longer distracted by the demands of work, family, or even the steady hum of our thoughts. It's as though the stillness itself becomes a canvas upon which He can speak to our hearts. He wakes us not with words, but with a knowing, a gentle beckoning toward deeper intimacy and understanding. In the solitude of these early hours, God desires for us to acknowledge His presence. He wants us to recognize that even in the absence of sound, His voice is there, and in the absence of the world's clamor, we can hear it more clearly. It is not an intrusion, but a reminder. He is always with us, always calling, always waiting for us to be still enough to listen. These 3 a.m. moments are a reflection of divine attention, God's ability to tune into our hearts at any time, to draw near when we least expect it, and to make us aware that we are never truly alone. At 3 a.m., when the world around us is cloaked in quiet, we are often left with nothing but our own thoughts. The distractions of the day have faded into silence, and we find ourselves in a space where reflection becomes unavoidable. This quietude, while seemingly simple, carries profound significance. It is in these moments, removed from the noise and rush of everyday life, that we can truly turn inward and consider the state of our hearts, our minds, and our spirits. In the stillness, we are forced to confront that which we might usually avoid. The mind, when given the space to wander, often brings forth unresolved questions, doubts, and concerns, things we may not have had time to process during the hustle of our waking hours. It is here, in this sacred silence, that God invites us to face these inner struggles. We are given the opportunity to wrestle with our own questions, to bring to light the thoughts that have remained buried beneath the surface. These moments of reflection, although uncomfortable at times, are an invitation for us to grow and seek deeper understanding. Quietude is not simply the absence of sound, it is the presence of something more, something that calls us to pause, to think, to be aware. In these late-night hours, we are encouraged to reflect on our lives from a perspective unclouded by the busyness of the world. It's a chance to take stock, to assess where we are on our journey, and to recalibrate our hearts toward what truly matters. It is in this moment of reflection that we can hear the faint whispers of divine truth, truth that is often drowned out by the clamor of daytime concerns. This quiet time is not one of solitude merely for the sake of being alone, but a solitude in which God's presence can be felt more intimately. The silence allows for a deeper connection with our own thoughts and emotions, as well as with the divine. In these precious hours, when the world sleeps and the distractions fade, we are given a rare opportunity to hear our own hearts more clearly and, perhaps more importantly, to hear the whisper of God that often speaks the loudest when everything else is still. Spiritual growth is rarely comfortable or predictable, and it often unfolds in ways we least expect. At 3 a.m., when the world is still, God may gently rouse us from sleep, not to interrupt us, but to guide us toward a deeper spiritual awakening. These moments in the quiet of the night are not simply interruptions. They are invitations to spiritual growth. God knows that in the stillness, when we are unguarded and vulnerable, we are most open to the lessons He longs to impart. It is in these precious hours that the soul is most receptive to transformation, for the distractions of daily life have faded and we are left to face ourselves with honesty and humility. Spiritual growth is not about gaining more knowledge or accumulating answers. It is, instead, a process of becoming more attuned to God's presence and His will in our lives. At 3 a.m., when everything seems still and the night feels endless, we are confronted with the realization that God is always at work within us, even when we cannot see it. These moments are an opportunity for God to shape us in ways that might not be evident in the busyness of daytime life. We are invited to grow in trust, to allow God to refine us, to strip away what is unnecessary, and to bring forth what is true and good. In the quiet of the night, God often speaks not in grand gestures, but in subtle nudges. It is in the vulnerability of the moment that we can experience the quiet, refining work of God in our hearts. Spiritual growth is often painful because it requires us to relinquish control, to surrender our own desires, and to trust that God knows what is best for us. The Bible teaches us that, children, we are about to begin to know Him. But it is in these moments of surrender, when we let go of our own will and yield to God's direction, that the most profound growth can occur. Each time we wake in the stillness and respond to God's call, we take another step in our spiritual journey, learning to become more like the person He created us to be. This growth is often invisible, not something that can be measured by outward success or visible change. Instead, it is a deepening of our relationship with God, a quiet maturing of our spirit. At 3 a.m., we are invited into a space where God can mold us quietly, gently, and profoundly. These early morning awakenings are not accidents, but intentional moments where God calls us into greater alignment with His purpose for our lives. In the stillness, He challenges us to grow, to stretch beyond our comfort zones, and to embrace the unknowns of the journey with faith and hope. Through these moments, God nurtures our spiritual growth, shaping us into something more beautiful than we could ever imagine. There is something uniquely powerful about the moment when God awakens us in the dead of night. It is more than the simple stirring of our physical bodies from sleep. It is the stirring of the heart itself. At 3 a.m., when all is quiet and the world outside seems far away, the heart is more vulnerable, more open. It is as though in this sacred hour, God has the space to get our attention, to call us to a deeper awareness of the longings within us, the questions we have buried, and the desires that have gone unnoticed. We may not even fully understand why we are awake, but in that stillness, we find that our hearts are suddenly more attuned to the divine presence than they are in the busyness of the day. The heart, often weighed down with the demands of life, can become calloused over time, resistant to the gentle nudging of God's voice. Yet in the stillness of the early hours, when there are no distractions to shield us, we are faced with the rawness of our own inner world. Our deepest emotions, fear, loneliness, hope, grief, come to the surface. In this vulnerable state, God can begin to soften us, to reach into the deepest parts of our being, where we may not even be aware of the need for healing or renewal. These 3 a.m. moments are in essence an invitation to open our hearts more fully to God's love and care. In the quiet of the night, God has the space to speak to our hearts in a way that cuts through the noise of our busy lives. He doesn't shout or demand attention. He whispers, calling us to come closer, to surrender anxieties and fears, to embrace the love that is always offered, but often ignored in the rush of the day. These moments can bring a profound sense of peace, a quiet assurance that we are not alone, that our hearts are seen, understood, and cared for by the one who made them. At 3 a.m. we are invited to awaken not just from sleep, but from the slumber of indifference or distraction that so often characterizes our spiritual lives. The heart that is awakened by God becomes more aware, more attuned to His presence in the world around us. The routine of life, the day-to-day responsibilities, often dulls our sensitivity to the divine, but in the stillness of the night, God's call comes with clarity. It is a beckoning to respond, to love more deeply, to trust more fully, to be more present in our relationship with Him. God's awakening of our hearts is an invitation to transformation, a call to live in a more profound way. It is a reminder that our hearts are not made to be numbed or dulled, but to feel deeply, to feel the love of God, to feel the brokenness of the world, to feel the call to change, to grow, and to be more fully alive in Him. In that quiet, early morning hour, we are invited to hear the heartbeat of the Creator and to align our own hearts with His, embracing the possibility of renewal and awakening that only He can offer. God's timing is a mysterious and often misunderstood thing. At 3 a.m., when the stillness of the night feels as if the world has paused, we may find ourselves awake for reasons we cannot immediately understand. In those moments, we may wonder, why now? Why us? Why this interruption at such an inconvenient hour? It is a time when our human understanding of time seems irrelevant, for God's sense of timing is not bound by the same constraints that govern our lives. We might view this awakening as an intrusion, but in reality, it is an expression of divine wisdom. A moment when God knows we are most receptive, most in need of His presence, even if we are not yet aware of it. We live in a world that prizes productivity and precision, where timing is everything. Appointments are kept, schedules are met, and minutes are counted. We are conditioned to think that the right moment is the one that fits neatly within our plans. But God operates outside of these boundaries. His timing doesn't follow the predictable patterns we expect. Instead, it unfolds according to His perfect understanding of our lives, our hearts, and our growth. At 3 a.m., God may awaken us precisely because He knows that this moment, this still, quiet hour, is the time when we are most ready to hear Him. He knows that in the silence, when the distractions of the day are absent, our hearts and minds are clearer, more open to hearing His voice and receiving His guidance. In our impatience, we might resist the idea of divine timing, wanting things to unfold according to our own schedules. But God's timing is not about our convenience. It's about His care and the deeper purposes He is working out in our lives. He knows when we are ready to receive His answers, when we are ready to face the challenges ahead, and when we are ready to grow spiritually. Often, we might wish for things to happen sooner, for answers to come quickly, but God in His wisdom knows that the timing must be right for us to be truly transformed. At 3 a.m., when we are awake in the stillness, God may be working in ways we cannot see, preparing us for what is to come, or leading us to a deeper understanding of ourselves and of Him. This divine timing also reminds us that God is not governed by our sense of urgency. He doesn't rush us, but instead invites us to trust in His pace, to wait when necessary, and to act when the time is right. It is often in these moments of unexpected wakefulness that we are called to pause and listen, not for an immediate solution, but for a deeper sense of trust in the unfolding of His plan. We may not understand why we are awake at 3 a.m., but we can trust that in His perfect timing, He has a purpose for that moment. Whether it is to deepen our faith, to provide clarity in a time of confusion, or simply to remind us that He is always present, even in the quiet of the night. God's timing may feel inconvenient or perplexing in the moment, but in hindsight, we often come to see that it was the perfect moment, the exact moment we needed to encounter Him. The disruption of sleep becomes a catalyst for something far greater, a reminder that God's ways are higher than our own, that His timing is impeccable, and that we are always held in His care, even in the most unexpected of hours. The struggle between our will and surrender is one of the most profound and persistent battles of the human experience. At 3 a.m., when we are unexpectedly awakened, the tension between our desires and God's call becomes painfully clear. It is in the quiet of the night, when we might long to remain asleep, that the choice to surrender becomes most apparent. There is something deeply uncomfortable about surrendering our own will, especially when we feel the weight of exhaustion or frustration. The mind races, thoughts swirl, and we question why this moment, this disturbance, has come. Yet it is precisely here, in the moment of awakening, that God beckons us to let go of our own agenda and trust His divine purpose for the interruption. Our natural instinct is to resist. We cling to the desire for control, for predictability, for peace as we know it. The desire to stay in our own rhythms, our own routines, is a powerful force. In those early hours, when the world around us is still and our minds are less distracted, we may find ourselves wrestling with God, struggling to understand why He would interrupt our rest. We may long to ignore the call, to turn away from the quiet invitation to engage with Him. But it is in that very resistance that we come face to face with the deeper struggle, the clash between our will, with all its limitations, and the divine will, which is perfect and infinite. Surrender does not come easily. It demands a level of trust that we are not always willing to give, especially when our understanding is limited. We want answers now, solutions to our problems immediately, and peace in our own timing. But God asks us to trust in His plan, even when we cannot see the bigger picture. The struggle between will and surrender often feels like a battle of opposing forces. Our desire to control, to manage our own life, versus the call to release, to give over to something greater than ourselves. And yet, in that moment of surrender, when we choose to release our grasp on our own plans and submit to God's will, we find freedom. Freedom not from the difficulty of the moment, but from the burden of trying to carry everything ourselves. The act of surrender at 3 a.m. is an invitation to acknowledge that we are not the masters of our own lives, nor are we meant to be. It is an opportunity to step away from the pressure of our self-imposed deadlines, our need for immediate answers, and to place our trust in the hands of the One who knows all things. God does not wake us up at 3 a.m. to burden us, but to allow us the space to let go, to release our worries and anxieties, and to rest in His care. It is in this surrender that we begin to understand the depth of His love for us, a love that is not bound by our resistance, but that calls us into deeper relationship. Surrendering our will to God is not a one-time event, but a continual practice. Every time we wake in the night, every time we struggle with a decision or face an uncertain path, we are presented with the choice to let go of our own plans and trust in His timing, His wisdom, and His purposes. Each act of surrender is a small victory, a reminder that God is in control, even when we cannot see or understand the way forward. It is in these moments that we grow spiritually, learning that true peace comes not from our ability to control, but from our willingness to trust and let go. In a world constantly filled with distractions, the noise of life often drowns out the quiet, steady voice that speaks to our hearts. The constant hum of activity, the flood of information, the demands of work, family, and society, These things crowd our minds and obscure our ability to hear anything beyond the cacophony of modern existence. We have become so accustomed to noise that silence, even for a moment, can feel foreign, uncomfortable. Yet it is in the breaking through this noise, often in the stillness of the night, that we are most able to hear the voice of God. At 3 a.m., when everything around us is silent, when the busyness of the day has dissipated, we find ourselves in an unexpected place of clarity. It is as if the world pauses for a moment, allowing us the space to tune in to something far deeper than the endless barrage of external stimuli. In this quiet, we are invited to listen, not just with our ears, but with our hearts. The noise of the world has a way of covering up our true needs, our deepest questions, and our longings for something more. It creates a barrier between us and the divine, one that we often don't even realize is there until we are forced to confront it. Breaking through the noise means more than simply turning off the distractions. It involves actively quieting the internal clamor that fills our minds. Our thoughts race, our worries surface, and our to-do lists reappear at the most inconvenient times. But when we awaken in the early hours, and the world is still, we are given a rare opportunity to confront those distractions head-on. We are given the chance to still our hearts and minds, to stop for a moment and focus not on the noise around us, but on the presence that is quietly waiting to be heard. In these sacred hours, God's voice often comes not in a loud or dramatic fashion, but in a whisper, a subtle nudge that requires our full attention. It is easy to miss if we are not paying close attention. In the silence, we are invited to break through the layers of noise that have built up over time, layers of worry, fear, and busyness, and to hear the truth that lies beneath. This moment of clarity is an opportunity to hear not only God's voice, but also the deeper voice of our own soul, the voice that has been drowned out by the world's demands, the voice that yearns for meaning, for connection, for peace. Breaking through the noise is a spiritual practice. It requires intention, focus, and a willingness to embrace the discomfort of silence. It means stepping away from the familiar chaos and into a space where we are forced to confront what truly matters. It is often in these quiet moments that we are able to hear God most clearly, to discern His will, and to receive the guidance we have been seeking. The noise of life may return in the morning, but the stillness of the night offers us a precious gift, a moment to pause, to listen, and to reconnect with the source of all peace. The breakthrough is not always immediate, and the clarity we seek may not come in the form we expect, but in the quiet, we are able to strip away the distractions and get closer to the heart of the matter, closer to God, and closer to the truth that resides in us all. This is the beauty of those late-night awakenings. They are not disturbances but invitations. An invitation to hear beyond the noise and to encounter something far deeper, something eternal, that is always waiting for us if we are willing to listen. Prayers in the night hold a profound intimacy and urgency, often taking on a depth that is hard to experience during the daylight hours. When we are awakened at 3 a.m., there is a quiet invitation to enter into a space of prayer that is less encumbered by the busyness of life, a time when our hearts and minds are more vulnerable, more open to God's presence. It is as if the stillness of the night allows us to step beyond our own limitations and step into a sacred conversation with the divine. In the dark hours, our prayers can be raw, unfiltered, and deeply personal, an unburdening of our soul that may not happen when the world is awake. The act of praying in the night is an acknowledgement that God is not bound by time or circumstance. He is always present, even when we are awake in the solitude of the night. It is a reminder that prayer is not confined to the structured times of the day or the comfortable settings of our lives. God is available in every moment, especially when we find ourselves in the stillness of the night, often feeling disconnected or alone. There is something incredibly intimate about calling out to God when the world is sleeping, when we are not distracted by external noise, and when we can fully focus on the conversation with our Creator. It is in these moments that we can express our deepest fears, our greatest hopes, and our sincerest gratitude, knowing that we are heard, even if no one else is around to witness our vulnerability. Prayers in the night often carry a sense of urgency, as if the quiet hours awaken a sense of both need and longing within us. The soul, having been through a long day of distractions, is unburdened, and in the stillness begins to surface its hidden cries. The prayers we speak in these moments may not be polished or elegant. They may not be filled with eloquent words. They may be simple pleas for peace, for clarity, for healing, or for guidance in moments of confusion. The night becomes a sacred space to wrestle with God, to ask the difficult questions, and to find solace in His presence. We may not receive immediate answers, but the act of offering our prayers at such an intimate hour draws us closer to God's heart and allows us to sense His nearness in a way that is sometimes more elusive during the hustle of the daytime hours. In the quiet of the night, there is no rush, no ticking clock pushing us to finish our prayers. There is a certain freedom in these moments, freedom to express the unspoken, to pour out our hearts without fear of judgment or interruption. These prayers, unhurried and uninterrupted, become an offering, a conversation where we are both speaking and listening. In this sacred space, we allow God to speak to us in return, whether through a quiet assurance, a stirring thought, or a deep sense of peace. Sometimes our prayers are not answered in the way we expect, but they always serve to deepen our relationship with God, to fortify our trust, and to remind us that we are never alone, even in the dark. Nighttime prayers also reveal the beauty of God's timing. The world is still, and in this stillness we are reminded that God doesn't need our prayers to be neatly packaged into certain hours or formats. He desires our hearts, open, raw, and surrendered. He welcomes the simplest cries of desperation or the most grateful words of thanksgiving. And in these moments, even if our prayers feel uncertain or incomplete, we are met with the full assurance of God's love and attention. Our words, our thoughts, our deepest yearnings do not fall on deaf ears. They are heard and they are cherished. Prayers in the night remind us that God is always near. He is never too distant to hear our cries, even in the darkest hours. The night becomes a time of intimacy and connection, a space where we can bring all that we are, with all our burdens and joys, and place them before the One who is always listening. And in this quiet, sacred hour, God's presence becomes tangible. His peace envelops us, and we are reminded once again that we are never truly alone. In a world that never seems to stop, stillness often feels like a distant and elusive concept. Our lives are filled with constant movement, physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual. The relentless pace of modern existence, coupled with the barrage of stimuli we encounter daily, creates a sense of disconnection from the quietude that our souls desperately crave. Yet, it is in moments of stillness, especially in the early hours of the morning when everything is hushed, that we can experience the deepest power of peace. In those precious moments, when everything slows down and the noise of the world recedes, we are given the chance to hear the whisper of God, to reconnect with our own hearts, and to feel the presence of something far greater than ourselves. Stillness is not simply the absence of sound or motion. It is the presence of something deeper. It is in stillness that the noise of our anxieties, fears, and busyness can fall away, creating space for us to encounter the sacred. And this is how our sorrows are transformed. At 3 a.m., when the world is asleep and all is quiet, we find that the distractions that typically fill our thoughts have been silenced. In this space, we are free from the pressure to act, to solve problems, or to perform. We are simply allowed to be. It is in this stillness that we often encounter God in a profound and intimate way. It is in this moment of quiet that His presence becomes more palpable, more accessible, and more real. Stillness, while often uncomfortable at first, offers a kind of power that we cannot find in the chaos of our daily lives. In the stillness, we are forced to face our own thoughts, our own feelings, and our own uncertainties. We are left with nothing but the rawness of our being, and while this can be unsettling, it is precisely in this rawness that we often find healing. In the absence of noise and distraction, we can process the pain, confusion, and questions that we may have been avoiding. The power of stillness lies not in its silence, but in its ability to bring us face to face with our true selves, to confront what lies beneath the surface, and to invite God into those spaces of vulnerability. Furthermore, stillness offers us the chance to hear God's voice more clearly. The world is loud, and our lives are often filled with so many demands and voices that we may struggle to hear what God is saying. But in the quiet of the night, when we are alone with our thoughts and with Him, we can attune our hearts to His gentle whispers. God speaks not in the crashing of waves or the roaring of storms, but in the quiet of a still moment, in the peace that transcends understanding. It is in these moments of stillness that we can sense His guidance, His comfort, and His presence more strongly than at any other time. The power of stillness also lies in its ability to ground us. In a world that pulls us in every direction, the stillness provides a place of rest, a sanctuary where we can reconnect with our purpose and our calling. It is in stillness that we are reminded that we are not defined by our accomplishments, our busyness, or the external markers of success. We are defined by our relationship with God, and in the stillness, we can more fully experience the truth of who we are in His eyes. It is a reminder that our worth is not found in our productivity or the noise we create, but in the quiet, intimate connection we have with the Creator of the universe. In stillness, we also find a kind of rest that our souls desperately need. The constant striving, the constant movement can lead to burnout and exhaustion, but the stillness offers a space for renewal. In those moments when we choose to be still, to stop and listen, we find the peace that only God can give. The noise of the world cannot offer the rest that comes from God's presence. Stillness is a retreat from the chaos, a refuge where we can experience His peace. And in that peace we are strengthened, restored, and equipped to face the demands of life with a renewed sense of purpose and clarity. Ultimately, the power of stillness is that it brings us closer to God. In the quiet moments, when we stop and listen, we open ourselves to His transformative power. Stillness allows us to be present with God, to sit in His presence without the need for words, without the need for activity. It is in these moments of stillness that our souls are nourished, our hearts are healed, and our spirits are renewed. In the stillness, we learn to rest in the truth that God is always with us, that He is enough, and that in His presence we find everything we truly need. A call to trust is a call to surrender, to release control, and embrace the unknown with faith that God is guiding our steps, even when we cannot see the path ahead. At 3 a.m., when we are often most vulnerable, and our minds are filled with questions, doubts, and fears, this call becomes particularly poignant. The stillness of the night seems to magnify our uncertainties, and in these moments the invitation to trust in God becomes not just a theological idea, but a deeply personal challenge. It asks us to let go of our need to understand everything, to control every outcome, and to trust that God, in His infinite wisdom, is at work in ways we cannot always perceive. Trusting God does not mean having all the answers, or knowing exactly what the future holds. It is not a blind leap into the dark, but a conscious decision to believe that God's plans are far greater than our own understanding. At 3 a.m., when the world is still and our hearts are exposed, We may feel the weight of life's uncertainties more keenly. We may feel unsure of what lies ahead, of how our challenges will be resolved, or whether we are on the right path. But in these quiet hours, we are invited to stop striving and to place our trust not in our own ability to manage our lives, but in God's ability to guide us through every storm, every trial, and every unknown. This call to trust is not a passive acceptance of fate, but an active, deliberate choice to place our confidence in God's character and His promises. It is a recognition that we do not have to have everything figured out, that we can rest in the assurance that God is good, that He is faithful, and that He works all things together for our good. When we trust, we acknowledge that God's timing, though often different from our own, is always perfect. At 3 a.m., when we are tempted to give in to anxiety, fear, or worry, trusting in God means choosing to believe that He is in control. Even when everything feels uncertain, trusting God is also a call to surrender our desires and expectations. It is easy to trust God when things are going well, when our lives are unfolding according to our plans. But in the moments of struggle, in the hours when our hearts ache, and when the path forward seems unclear, trust becomes a challenge. Yet it is in these moments that trust can take on its deepest form. It is not in the absence of struggle that we grow in trust, but through the very act of handing over our fears and anxieties to God, knowing that He is big enough to hold them. At 3 a.m., when we are wide awake with worry, we are called to choose peace over panic, faith over fear. In this surrender we find rest, not because we have all the answers, but because we trust in the One who holds them all. Trust also invites us into a deeper relationship with God. It requires us to let go of the illusion of control and to lean into His presence, knowing that He is not distant or indifferent to our struggles, but actively involved in our lives. To trust God is to allow Him to be our refuge and our strength, our comfort in times of trouble, and our guide in moments of uncertainty. In the stillness of the night, when everything else is quiet, we can hear His invitation to trust more fully, to rely on Him more completely, and to rest in the knowledge that we are held by a love that is unshakable. At 3 a.m., as we wrestle with our own thoughts and fears, the call to trust becomes an opportunity to experience God in a deeper way. Allah Almighty, for effect ust faria impathelite. It is not about having the right answers or understanding everything perfectly, but about believing in the goodness and faithfulness of God, even in the midst of our doubts. Trust is not always easy, but it is always worth it. It is in trusting God, in choosing to let go and rely on His wisdom and grace, that we find peace that passes understanding. And in this peace, we are reminded that we are never truly alone, that God is always with us, guiding, comforting, and leading us into the future He has prepared for us.